of people that we love to have here. Lieutenant Colonel Jay Stout. I'm not sure how many times you've been with us now. It's been a number of years.
Sure.
And I want to thank him because he used to be a little closer, but he's on the other side of the country now. Lieutenant Colonel Jay Stout is retired from the United States Marine Corps as a fighter pilot. He's a native of Indiana, and he went to Purdue University. He was commissioned in 1981, designated a naval aviator. In 1983, he flew the F-4S Phantom, one of which that we do have here. We do have a Phantom here. He continued in his military career. He had a stint as an instructor pilot in Texas from 1986 to 89, and then he transitioned to the FA-18 Hornet, one of which we've got getting painted outside today. You may have noticed that the aircraft outside was in need of a little help, and we want to acknowledge that we are fortunate enough to have VMFA 323, the Death Rattlers out there, taking care of the paint job on it for us. So that's an awesome thing, and we appreciate them doing that service for the museum. After Jay retired from the military in 2001, he got involved in publishing and authoring various things. He's been the author of various journals and newspapers he's worked with, and he's had his work read on the floor of the United States Senate. He's recognized as a military subject matter expert, of which we're going to hear more about today. He's appeared on Fox News Network, Al Jazeera, National Public Radio, as well as dozens of regional and local affiliates. Here with us all the way from the East Coast. Thank you for coming out and bringing your wife, Monica. We thank you both. We hope coming out to Palm Springs in April wasn't too much of an imposition. No. How about a handful of it?
Thanks, Greg. Can you hear me? Okay, thanks, Greg, for those very kind words. And thanks to the staff and the board here for inviting me back again to speak at this world-class institution. And thanks to you as well for investing some of your time into learning a little bit about Hamilton McWhorter III, one of the Navy's most accomplished fighter pilots in all their history. We're going to talk about Mac, which is how I learned to call him Never Ham. He hated that. But we're going to talk about Mac for about 45 minutes or so. Before we do that, however, we're going to talk about my most favorite topic, me. I'm very proud of myself. I consider my professional life, my personal life, all the successes made possible by that lady. And I consider myself somewhat of a cool cat. But it only takes a very little bit of reflection to understand that I will never be as cool as that cat. That is Hamilton McWhorter III. Many of his family are here, and I appreciate that. I first met him about 25 years ago, and I was intimidated. I felt like an 8-year-old boy going to visit with a Major League All-Star, mostly because I was aware of what he had accomplished during World War II and subsequently, but also I felt like an 8-year-old boy because he was about this tall and had shoulders this big. He was a giant of a man, but he was the quintessential gentleman as well. A big heart, very considerate of others, very intelligent, very hardworking. He always worked to make sure everyone felt comfortable around him. I also had the opportunity to work with and get to know his wife, Louise. A tall woman as well, a lovely woman, smart, worked to make sure everybody felt comfortable around her, and also a force to be reckoned with in her own right. She was a very forthright personality, especially when it came to taking care of Mac. In the years after the book, I enjoyed a relationship with Mac and Louise, and after they both passed, I still sometimes caught myself going to the computer to send an email or picking up the phone and realizing that they were gone. But I do treasure that time I was able to spend with them. Now, Mac had a fairly typical middle class growing up during the Depression. He grew up in the South, Athens, Georgia, was interested in aviation as were most of his peers during the Depression. He recalled his first airplane ride. His uncle had bought a ticket for him and his cousin to ride on this aircraft, the Ford Trimotor, which you can recognize. Someone snatched away a child's concept of what an aircraft should look like and built the Ford Trimotor, which actually was a pretty good aircraft for its time. Mac decided he wanted to see or to become a fighter pilot when he heard that some of these beauties were down at the airfield. These are Boeing P-26s. These were the Army's first all-metal fighter aircraft and first monoplane aircraft. He pedaled his bike down there as fast as he could and arrived just as they were getting ready to take off. And as these aircraft swung around to line up on the runway and ran their engines up, he got covered in aviation gas and oil and dirt and grit, and he remembered it as one of the best memories from his childhood. He was set on becoming a fighter pilot. Unusually, he went to both Georgia Tech and Georgia. He was intent on becoming an aeronautical engineer. The coming war kind of got in the way of those plans. At the same time, he enrolled in the civilian pilot training program. This was a program, government funded, whereby interested individuals could sign up for training up to the level of a private pilot's license and sometimes a little bit beyond. Mac enrolled in this, and it was a big success. Mac did very well. The government did it for two reasons. Number one, to generate interest in the aviation industry, but also to kind of generate a pool of screened candidates for military training if it came time that the United States was going to war. It was, as I said, a big success. They ran about 500,000 people through this program, and it was open to men, women, people of color. It was a program that had broad reach and broad attraction. Mac decided to go to the Navy. Number one, he liked their uniforms. He thought it was pretty neat that they landed aboard ships. He liked the notion of clean sheets, a clean bed every night, as well as good chow. So he started through the V5 Aviation Cadet Program, and this was a program whereby the Navy kind of militarized or navalized young civilian men, indoctrinating them into a military lifestyle. They taught things like professional military courtesies, various academic subjects that might be useful later during flight training. There was a big emphasis on physical training, as you can see there. And after several weeks, Mac finished that and was sent to Naval Air Station Pensacola, Florida, which is known as the cradle of naval aviation. Now, Navy flyers, long before Mac went to Pensacola, Mac went to Pensacola, I went to Pensacola, and the kids who are learning to fly with the Navy now start out at Pensacola. And you look at that building and you think, oh, what's that about? That's called the Octagon. It predated the Civil War, but during Mac's time, this was the officers' club. That's where they went to have a drink. Mac started out in the N3N primary trainer. Looks a lot like the Army's PT-17, but in fact was a completely different aircraft. The Navy manufactured it in their own factory, which was an unusual arrangement then and now. Matriculated onto the SNJ, which was simply a variation of the AT-6, which has been out on the ramp taking folks for rides today. There are hundreds of them still around the globe flying today. Great aircraft, as opposed to this hot mess of an airplane. Now, Mac was selected to fly fighters, and he was overjoyed at that prospect. They sent him down to Miami, where he learned to fly this beast, the Brewster Buffalo. It was overweight, it was underpowered, it was unreliable, it was hard to fly, but at least it was ugly. But Mac did well in this aircraft. He had a set of landing gear collapse underneath him, no fault of his own. Again, that unreliability. The Navy operated these in frontline units, Navy and Marine Corps, for only about 2 years. The Marines flew them out of Midway during the Battle of Midway, were badly handled by the Japanese because, again, this was probably the worst fighter the Navy ever acquired. The British operated them. They were badly handled by the Japanese in Southeast Asia, as were the Dutch, who operated them in Dutch Southeast Asia. Curiously, the Finland acquired about 45 of these things, and they loved them. They used them against the Soviets, and actually Finland had 36 pilots become aces against the Soviets flying this aircraft. I don't know what that says about the Finns or about the Soviets, but it worked out really well for them. So Mac was commissioned an ensign and was awarded his Navy Wings of Gold in early 1942, was sent to learn to fly this aircraft, the Grumman F4F Wildcat, one of which we have here. I didn't know I was going to have stage props, but one of these is, an example is right there. Now, aviation experts have a word for an aircraft that looks like this. And I know it's on the tips of a lot of tongues out there. I'll help you out. That word is ugly. This aircraft is a barrel with wings. No one ever called this aircraft pretty. But beauty is as beauty does. You could shoot this aircraft, you could stab it with a knife, you could crunch it in the ground, you could poison it, you could call it hurtful names, but you better not turn your back on it because it's still alive and it's going to try and kill you. A lot of Japanese pilots learned that. This aircraft was very over-engineered, brought a lot of pilots back when other aircraft would have failed and they would have ended up in the drink. And that was the beauty about the F4F Wildcat. Wasn't the Navy's first choice. They had a competition in the late 1930s, and that ugly Brewster Buffalo won. But during the time the Navy was realizing that the Buffalo was not the aircraft they had hoped it would be, Grumman continued to improve this aircraft. And it wasn't a great aircraft in terms of raw performance. It was fast enough, it was maneuverable enough. It carried 4 50 caliber machine guns and later 6 50 caliber machine guns, and it held the line against the Japanese during the war. In fact, there are only two American aircraft, who started the war with frontline units and ended the war with frontline units. One was a P-38 Lightning, the other was this aircraft. The Royal Navy, the British, flew these off of their carriers, and 3 days before the Germans surrendered, May 5th, 1945, the British flew a strike against a target using this aircraft. When Japan surrendered at the end of 1945, September 1945, these aircraft were on escort carriers and jeep carriers, United States Navy. So a tough little aircraft that could do the job. It was good enough for what it was for. Mac liked it well enough. Number one, he fit in it, which is a big thing. He was assigned to VF-9, Fighting 9. They were the first unit to move to the new Naval Air Station in Oceana, Virginia. That air station today is the largest naval aviation installation in the world, but when Mac moved there, it was a runway, a bunch of mud, and a few Quonset huts. After several months of training, they went to war. And you look at that photo and you think, 1942, that's too early for D-Day. And was it somewhere in the Pacific? And no, they went off to fight the French. And you'd say, the French? No, no. And I would say, oui. Some of you might know or recall that when France surrendered to Germany in June of 1940, they reached an arrangement whereby a significant portion of France would remain unoccupied and administered by a French government that was headquartered or located in the seaside resort city or town of Vichy, hence the name Vichy, France. Part of that arrangement was that Vichy, France would be able to keep and administer all their overseas territories. Some of those were in North Africa. And the Allies, namely the Americans and the British, wanted those territories in North Africa to better prosecute the campaign that was already ongoing in North Africa, campaign in the Mediterranean, and also the subsequent campaigns in Sicily and Italy. But the planners for this invasion, which was codenamed Operation Torch, dealt with a huge uncertainty. Would the French fight? No one knew. In fact, the invasion took place on November 8, 1942, and the average French soldier on the ground and the flyer in the air had no orders otherwise, and in fact did fight with a great deal of vigor. In fact, 500 Americans were killed by the French during this 4-day campaign. Here you can see this was the area of operations. Here's the Mediterranean Sea. Really, I just like playing with this thing. Mac and VF-9 were embarked aboard the Ranger, interesting carrier. We won't talk about that much, but they operated right off the coast of Casablanca. I already indicated that the French resistance was pretty tough. The French pilots were very well trained and they were aggressive. They had experience from fighting the Germans earlier in the war, but ironically, their best fighter was the American-made, Army-operated P-36. The export version was called the Hawk 75. Army had started getting rid of these aircraft, but the French really liked them, and they had some successes against the Americans. After 2 or 3 days, they were beat down by numbers and by well-trained American crews and failed to remain a factor in the fight. Mack was a little upset that he did not get a chance to engage the French in air-to-air combat, but he was still very active. First time he fired his guns was against a trio of destroyers that tried to leave Casablanca harbor. They were turned back, and in fact, one of them ran itself aground. Mack also strafed some airfields. He destroyed 2 of these pretty little French fighters, Diwatin 520s, and is probably the only Navy pilot in history to have shot up one of these flying boats. Dating from the early 1930s, it was a Breguet 521. One of the strafing missions that stayed with him until the end of his life, his commanding officer dove on a French fuel tanker that was motoring down the highway, and it exploded in flames, and they saw the driver tumble out of the cab, all in flames, rolling on the ground, trying unsuccessfully to put those flames out, and essentially they watched that Frenchman burn to death, and that stuck with Mack. Mack was also part of a flight that was strafing a heavily defended French headquarters. And a machine gun round came through the windscreen, went right past his ear, and hit the armor plate behind his head in this little aircraft here. He said he lost interest very quickly in strafing that command post anymore. The campaign ended on Armistice Day, 1942. Most of the naval forces returned very quickly back to Norfolk, Virginia. Now, VF-9 had lost about 5 pilots during this short campaign, and one of them was Charlie Gerhardt. He had been on a strafing mission, had been hit, and then nobody saw what happened to him. In fact, he went down in the water, was rescued by a destroyer. The destroyer picked him up, headed back for Norfolk once the fighting was done, but never told anybody that they had Charlie Gerhardt with them. And so when the Ranger and VF-9 get back to the pier and they come off the pier, there's Charlie Gerhardt. and he says, "Hey, fellas, I'm still alive, and I am having a resurrection party tonight at my house, and everybody needs to come. And Mac, I've got someone special I need you to meet." So the party gets going, and it is roaring along. And about midnight, there's a knock on the door, and Charlie says, "Hey, Mac, go open the door." And Mac goes over there, throws the door open, and there is a tall, beautiful, blonde, perfectly made for Mac McWhorter, and he reaches out, pulls her close, plants a big kiss on his lips, and he told me, he goes, "I'm a pretty modest fellow, but I don't think she minded that kiss one bit." Mac was smitten. And Louise, of course, was very fond of Mac, but she wasn't going to put all her eggs in one basket, and she was dating other aviators, and other aviators from other services, believe it or not. And Mac turned to her one night on a date, and he said, "Well, if I'm going to be able to have you whenever I want to have you, I guess I'm going to have to marry you." And Louise turned to him and said, "Yes." And there started a great romance. They were married. Mac was floating around in the Atlantic on November 11th. They were married January 16th, 1943. Pretty whirlwind romance. Did I get that date right? January 16th? Now, McWhorter family here, I'm sure on reflection you're thinking, hooray for Charlie Gerhardt and hooray for the French gunners who shot him down. So I should make the point here that during World War II, the United States manufactured 300,000 aircraft. It was incredible. 65,000 of those aircraft were lost. And of those 65,000 aircraft that were lost, about half of them were lost to training accidents. And that certainly applied to VF-9 as well. Mac's friend was Jim Feasley. And Jim had caught a cold and had heard that the best way to get rid of a cold was to drink a bunch of booze and then sweat it out, exercise it out. And Mac came back to the Quonset hut one night. He slept with 6 or 7 other folks, including Jim Feasley. And by this time, Jim had had quite a bit. And he realized, as we often do after half a bottle of bourbon, that he was probably not only the most intelligent man in the world and the best looking man in the world, but also the strongest man in the world. And he challenged everybody in the Quonset hut to a wrestling match. And everybody took turns dancing Jim around the floor until they were all exhausted, went to sleep. Next morning, they have a training mission, air-to-air gunnery without ammunition. The idea was one aircraft in the flight would fly straight and level while the other 3 aircraft flew practice gunnery runs against them. And Mac was the target, and he was watching everyone and turns and sees Jim Feasley, and Jim disappears behind him, and he looks and feels a mighty smash. Looks at his left wing, it's almost cut in half, the aileron is gone, and he sees Jim Feasley tumbling towards the water, and everybody in the flight is shouting at Jim to jump out. Whether Jim was killed or unconscious is unknown, but he did not. He hit the water and, of course, was never recovered. But these sorts of losses were very common. Mac lost a lot of friends in combat and in training, and I know that those stuck with him throughout his life. F-6F Hellcat. I know a lot of you are looking at that photo and thinking, that's not a Hellcat. And I know it's not. It's an F-4U Corsair. VF-9 was told by the Navy, hey, you are going to be the first squadron to get the hottest fighter we got, the F-4U Corsair. And it was a hot fighter. It was the first fighter to exceed 400 miles an hour in level flight. That happened in 1940. And the pilots were very excited, and the Navy sent them up to the factory to watch them being manufactured. And then the Navy said, sorry, we misspoke. Corsair's not ready. Instead, we are going to give you the hottest Navy fighter in the world that's ready now. And that was the F-6F Hellcat, one of which is here with its wings folded. And I know that a lot of you are thinking, that aircraft looks a lot like the other one, the F4F, right here. And yeah, they were manufactured by the same company, and they shared some family resemblances. But the younger brother, much more handsome aircraft, better than the F4F in every way. It was faster, it was more powerful, importantly, it was not ugly. It could go higher, it could go further, it could carry more ammunition. It had hydraulic systems to raise the landing gear, which was important. This aircraft, the pilot had to crank the landing gear up after he took off. 30 turns on this hand crank, and God forbid you let go, because that handle was going to come spinning back, and if your hand was in the way, you were going to break your wrist. You could always spot a Wildcat pilot because he had a splint on his hand from having his wrist broken. This is a big airplane. A lot of you know that the P-47, the Army's P-47, was the largest single-engine fighter of the war. This aircraft was the second largest single-engine fighter of the war. Very importantly, it was easy to fly, it was easy to maintain. I asked Mac, was there anything about the Wildcat that you missed when you went to the Hellcat? And he said there was nothing at all. The F6F was better in every way. So VF-9 continued to train and train and train, and then they were embarked aboard the USS Essex. It was the first in a class of the big deck carriers that the Navy used to ultimately dominate Japan. It was much bigger than its earlier carriers, much more modern, much more efficient. And the Navy did a smart thing. They took the ships along with the ship's crew or the ship's company, put the air crew or the air groups aboard the ship, and then sent them off to the Caribbean on a shakedown cruise, where they would sail around and practice combat evolutions for about a month. And it worked real well, paid big dividends. But they continued to have training losses. You'll recall Charlie Gerhardt, who introduced Mac and Louise. He had a bad landing. His aircraft dribbled off the side, went into the water. When it did, the canopy jammed shut, and the ship's crew watched as Charlie tried to pull that canopy back and could not, and the aircraft slid beneath the waves, and Charlie was lost. Ultimately, VF-9 and the Essex went to the Pacific. They arrived in Pearl Harbor at the very end of May 1943, where they went through several more months of training. Now, the Navy was holding the line in the Pacific by mid-1943 pretty well, but they had also lost a lot of carriers. You know, the Navy sunk 4 Japanese carriers at Midway, but they had also lost the Lexington at Coral Sea, the Langley before that, the Yorktown at Midway, I believe the Hornet and the Wasp, and 1 or 2 others I can't remember. So the Navy wasn't going to send carriers in there one at a time. It was going to wait until it had several aircraft carriers with crews that were well trained, and then commit them in large task forces. They finally get to combat in September 1943. They go to Marcus Island, and this was kind of a training run. It was an isolated Japanese outpost. There was no aerial resistance. But at Wake Island, the following month, October 1943, there was. And Mac was in a strafing run against an installation at Midway. He came off the target, started climbing, and spotted a Japanese Zero. He closed the range, captured the Zero in his gun sight, pulled the trigger, and shot it down. Now, this was, in Mac's career, his superpower. He was an excellent aerial marksman. And I don't know in all the air forces in World War II, both U.S. and foreign, if anybody who shot down as many aircraft as he did, ultimately 12, can make the same claim. But Mac never shot at an aircraft that did not go down. He told me he used to concentrate so hard that he pretended he only had 1 bullet to shoot down these enemy aircraft when in fact he had 6 machine guns. They go to Rabaul, and if any of you are familiar with the Discovery Channel's Dogfight series, Mac's dogfight here at Rabaul is featured, and it's pretty well done. I am not going to belabor it or go through it in detail, but if you don't feel like reading a book, look up the series. It's pretty neat. They next go to assist in the Marine invasion of Tarawa, which was a very bloody affair. On 18 November, Mac shoots down one of these float planes, a peculiar-looking duck. The next day, he's on combat air patrol, looks down and sees this Japanese bomber, a G4M Betty, skimming just above the water surface. He dives after it, gets set up, looks over his shoulder, and there's everybody else in the squadron trying to beat him to his airplane. He gets there first, squeezes the trigger for just an instant. His rounds hit the cockpit, hit one of the engines, the aircraft catches fire, tumbles into the water, and is destroyed. That makes Mac VF9's first ace and also the first pilot to become an ace while flying the F-6F Hellcat. He lands back aboard the aircraft carrier, and the armorers pull off the panels to the guns to reload the ammunition, and they look and realize he only fired 86 rounds to shoot down that bomber. That's really remarkable. Most pilots, they spray and hope. Mac was a marksman, and from that point, his commanding officer said, "Your name is One Slug," and that's the nickname he carried throughout the rest of his career. Goes to Kwajalein, shoots down 2 more Zeros, but he dove through a cloud deck, and when he came out underneath the clouds, there in front of him was a Japanese Zero. All he really needed to do was squeeze the trigger. And he was very fateful, I guess, about this. He recognized the fact that if he had been going a little bit faster, or if things were arranged just a little bit differently, it could have been him that popped out in front of that Japanese Zero. And when he missed big air battles, big engagements where other pilots had a lot of success, he was very frustrated, but also made the point, who knows, that could have been the fight in which I was shot down and killed. He goes to Truck, shoots down 3 more Zeros. This makes him the first Hellcat double ace and the leading carrier-based Navy ace in the war. He told a story about something that happened in Truck. His friend George Blair, a colorful character, but he had been shot down in the middle of Truck Lagoon, which is surrounded by Japanese outposts, and there's an air battle raging on, and the Japanese sent a patrol boat out to get him, and his flight fortunately had stayed with them, and they blow the Japanese gunboat out of the water, and they're waiting for the float plane to come pick him up. And the float plane pilot shows up, sees what's going on, and says, "I'm not going down there." And the leader of the Hellcat flight says, "The hell you're not. You're going down there, or I'm going to shoot your ass down." And so persuaded, that float plane pilot did exactly that, landed in the water and picked up George. You can see him in the back seat there waiting to be put back aboard ship. After 10 months, they returned to Pearl Harbor and then the United States. They'd spent 127 days at sea, 21 days in actual combat. You can see by the numbers there that VF9 did very well. In fact, they finished the war after another Pacific cruise as, I think, the second leading fighter squadron in the Navy. They did lose some aircraft and some pilots. If any of you has been separated from your family, wife, loved one for any length of time, you understand the visceral emotion, the longing to get back, and that's exactly what Mac went through waiting to get back to Louise. When he finally did, it was a very emotional reunion. Now, Mac was somewhat of a celebrity at this point in the war. We just reviewed his accomplishments. Air Group 9, when they came off the Essex, was featured by Life magazine, their May 1st, 1944 issue, And of course, Mac had a bit in that feature as well. Here you see him looking lovingly at Louise. He was sent to New York to do some talks and help raise money for war bonds, and also appeared on the Major Bowes Amateur Hour, a very popular radio show during the era. It was actually the progenitor of the Gong Show, if you all remember that show. Now, certainly when Mac left for the Pacific in 1943, the United States was on a war footing, but those efforts accelerated dramatically while he was gone, and he noted the difference. This was war on an industrial scale. If a person wasn't in uniform, there was a good chance they were working in a war factory or in some war-related industry. All the hometowns were empty of young men. Mac went back to his hometown, and all of his friends were gone. They were all in uniform or had gone elsewhere in the nation to do war work. Everything was rationed. It was very difficult to get goods. And as Mac and Louise traveled around the country to various bases, it was difficult to find lodging because everyone was on the move. And there were several nights they just spent the night in the car because they couldn't find anywhere to sleep. Now, VF9 was split in half. Half of the group stayed, or half the men stayed, so that when new personnel arrived, they could be trained by a combat experienced cadre, so that ultimately the Navy would end up with a well-trained squadron. The other half of VF9 was sent to VF12, where the same thing happened. That combat experienced cadre from VF9 trained new personnel as they arrived in VF12, and it worked pretty well. And VF12 traveled from Melbourne, Florida, to San Diego, to Astoria in Oregon, Pasco, Washington, and back to San Diego. It grew to such a size, so many aircraft and so many men, which says a lot about the nation's industry and its ability to train young men, that it grew to over 100 men. Mac didn't know half the people. They were coming and going. And so the Navy said, I got a solution for that. And they just administratively cut the squadron in half, said, you're VF-12, one half, the other half you're VB-12, bombing 12, when in reality, they both had the same missions. The Hellcat at that time in the war could drop bombs and shoot rockets and did so very effectively. And in fact, that's what Mac did during his second tour to the Pacific. They embarked aboard the USS Randolph, another Essex-class carrier, and almost immediately went to war against Japan. First mission was to Tokyo. Now, this was no longer on the doorstep of Japan. This was climbing over the doorstep, knocking down the door, going in the master bedroom, flipping over the mattress, breaking up all the furniture, going through the sock drawer for anything cool, and then setting the walk-in closet on fire. That's how dominant the Navy had become vis-a-vis Japan. The clock precludes us spending much time on his second Pacific cruise, but I'll cover some of the highlights. Again, first mission was to Tokyo, and Mac shot down a 0 on his first mission to Tokyo. They went to Iwo Jima, to where they were exposed to kamikaze pilots. During rest and refit at Ulithi Atoll, they were hit by a kamikaze. Mac was sitting in his office filling out paperwork and was literally knocked out of his chair. The attack killed about a couple dozen sailors and put the Randolph out of action for about 2 weeks. Mac was almost shot down over Yap Island. His left wing was hit, hydraulics caught fire, ammunition box caught fire. The aircraft nearly went down. Mac was hit again at Okinawa, and you can see that damage to the rear of his aircraft right here. And at Okinawa, he shot down, or near Okinawa, he shot down another aircraft, a Japanese reconnaissance aircraft. Off of Okinawa, they spent 54 days in combat, not including the other missions. Remember, his first Pacific cruise, they only spent 21 days in combat, and they lost a lot more men, both to combat and to accidents during this second cruise. Finally, during rest and refit off the coast of the Philippines, the Randolph was at anchor, And there were a couple of Army flyers, P-38 flyers, and they thought they'd show the Navy how real flying was done, and they were doing stunts, and one of them crashed into the Randolph, killed a dozen men, and destroyed 7 aircraft. And the Navy said, Air Group 12, you have met your mission, you're tired, we're sending you home. And Mac's war was over. He went on to have a 28-year career. He was awarded 5 Distinguished Flying Crosses. Any person with one would be busting his buttons. 20-year career, I never had one. Mac had 5. Congressional Gold Medal. He was among the original class of inductees that were brought into the Georgia Aviation Hall of Fame. Ultimately, he retired in 1969 after 28 years of service. He was the executive officer at Naval Air Station Miramar, from where I actually retired 31 years later. Now, his career, I've just summed it up in about 20 seconds, but you can imagine in 28 years what a number of wonderful things he got to do. But I think his legacy, or the legacy of which he was most proud, was the one he created with Louise. Mac and Louise had 65 years of marriage, 5 children, several of whom are here, and many friends. A tremendous legacy. And that's all I have. Are there any questions for me today? Thanks very much for your attention.